I grew up during the 80s in this little town called Durant, which is about 6 miles east of Brandon, Florida. Until I was 15 years old, my best friends in the world were these two kids named Bobby and Joey, and we were basically inseparable. Not only did we all go to the same elementary and middle schools, but we spent all of our free time together too. Bobby and Joey were like polar opposites. Like it was weird that we were even friends to begin with. Bobby was more outgoing while Joey was more reserved. Bobby would eat just about anything while Joey was easily the fussiest eater I've ever known. It extended to almost everything, including how scary they found horror movies. And boy, did we love horror movies. We tried just about every trick in the book to sneak into theaters to watch The Thing or Nightmare on Elm Street. Sometimes we succeeded and sometimes not. But when we did get in, the result was always the same. Joey would be on the verge of a panic attack for the entire showing, while Bobby would be complaining how it all looked fake or how it wasn't scary enough for him. Nothing seemed to be able to freak him out, not even the transformation scene in American Werewolf in London. He was impressed, sure, but not in the least bit grossed out or whatever. And I suppose that's why he thought the haunted house at a traveling fair wouldn't scare him either. It was late August of 1985 when the traveling fair came to town, and seeing as nothing good was showing down at the local movie theater, we figured we'd stop by to see what it was all about. It was all the usual stuff: cotton candy, fairground rides, BB shooting galleries, but the thing that really caught our attention was the haunted house. For a janky traveling fair, it actually looked pretty cool, and was certainly more of an attractive prospect than the carousel. So after finishing our hot dogs, we headed over to the ticket booth to ask them how much. I remember the guy in the booth had all this skeletal face paint on, and when we asked him for 3 tickets, he put on this spooky voice like, "Are you sure your boys have the constitution for such a terrifying trial?" We were just like, "Yeah, dude, just give us the tickets already." Then we walk up towards the entrance to go inside. So the way this thing was laid out was a giant box room that had been divided up into corridors. You made your way through various corridors, some which narrowed so you had to squeeze through them, and every so often, a mechanical doodad would jump out to scare you, or an actual person would. I'll admit that the actual people, one of which had a pretty cool Wolfman mask, were actually pretty creepy, especially the woman who pretended to be a statue, right up until we tried to pass her, then just touched my shoulder and it almost gave me a heart attack in the process. Gotta applaud that level of commitment and subtlety, right? Anyway, me and Joey thought it was pretty cool, even though he was so scared he was ready to puke, but Bobby thought the whole thing was dumb, so much so that he walked right up to the ticket vendor and demanded his money back. Of course, the guy just points to a little sign that says no refunds, but does so in such a dismissive way that Bobby just about exploded. He started ranting about how it was the worst haunted house he'd ever been to, and that no one in their right mind should ever pay for anything so terrible. The guy takes this for a minute or two, then lowers his voice and says something that seems to calm Bobby down. Then when he walks back to us, we find out that this is what the guy said. "If you really want to see something scary in there, come back later at around 10 p.m. You're still not satisfied, we'll give you your money back." It seemed sketchy, to say the least, but Bobby assured us that the guy was serious, and somehow we'd gotten it into our heads that we'd be getting to see the adult haunted house. Bearing in mind we were kids who had trouble getting into R-rated movies, so I don't think I could possibly understate how excited we were. We heard that traveling carnivals were known to get a little risque after dark, so the prospect of getting to see that sort of thing in action, it felt like a real adventure. Me and Joey had a curfew of 9 p.m., but we got around it by saying we were staying over at Bobby's. Only Bobby's mom worked as a night nurse on weekends, so there'd be no one around to disprove that. It was a foolproof plan. At least, it seemed that way for a while. But as a matter of fact, our little visit to the carnival would end our friendship and change our lives forever. The first sign that something was wrong was when we showed up and the whole place seemed to be closed down. There were lights on here and there, a few workers wandering around carrying heavy-looking tools, but other than that, the place was deserted. At first, I figured the guy had just played a trick on us, as in, come back later, but I'll be long gone. But Bobby was determined to get his money back, and we followed him through the carnival grounds until we came across the haunted house. True to his word, there was the ticket seller, sitting on the steel stairs that led up to the entrance. He made some comment about being surprised we'd showed up, how he'd figured we were too chicken to come back for the midnight show, as he called it. We just laughed. Midnight show? It wasn't a minute past 10 p.m., and there he was trying to be all spooky again. But then, Bobby asked him what was so scary about the midnight show and if he'd really be given a refund if it didn't frighten him. Again, the guy promises, if it doesn't spook him, he gets his money back. But what he said next really set me on edge and immediately had me thinking twice about my decision to return. He started off by saying how the carnival didn't like leaving paying visitors unhappy, and that if we really wanted to be scared, he could show us something that'd leave us very frightened indeed. He said it was something to keep in reserve for those dissatisfied with the haunted house, something that very few have come to witness without losing their sanity altogether. He said only a small, dedicated crew handles the midnight show, because the sheer psychological strain of the performance can be extremely harmful to their mental health. I remember Bobby piping up like, "I'm not dumb, dude. I see what you're doing. You're just gonna beat the snot out of us when we get in here, as payback for talking smack." The guy laughed, then swore on his mother's grave that each of us would walk in of our own volition and walk out totally unharmed. As for our sanity, he couldn't guarantee it'd still be in one piece by the end. Obviously, Joey was out from the word go. He's like, "Nope, screw this, I'm not going in." Bobby, on the other hand, was typical Bobby. I don't think wild horses could have dragged him away from that carnival. But me? There was something about the way the ticket vendor was talking. He wasn't trying to sound scary or be scary. He actually sounded kind of scared himself, almost like he didn't want us to go in. And either he was an Oscar-level acting talent or there really was something to what he was saying. I'll never forget the way Bobby looked at me when I said, yeah, I'm good actually. I think I'll stay here with Joey." It was like disgust mixed with ridicule. I know for a fact he thought I was being a big baby for having let the carny dude psych me out, but I made my mind up and I wasn't going to budge. In the end, Bobby went in on his own while me and Joey waited for him outside. I could tell he felt a little nervous walking in, but I was nervous too. I was nervous for him. Because as much as we'd be reassured that nothing was going to happen to him, a little piece of me still thought Bobby was going to get his bell rung as soon as he walked in. Me and Joey are outside for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, waiting for Bobby while wondering what could be going on in that haunted house. There wasn't any noise or anything, not like during the daytime when you could hear all those dumb evil laughter sounds and wolves howling and whatnot. And our walkthrough in the daytime had taken like 5 minutes tops. So when 20, then 25, then 30 minutes went by, we started to get pretty freaking worried for Bobby. Only right when we're about to go banging on the haunted house's door, Bobby reappears. No limps, no swelling, no bleeding. He looked okay, but he wasn't, and I'm not sure Bobby was ever really okay again. I remember walking back to his mom's place like it was yesterday and the exasperation I felt when we asked Bobby what happened, and all he said was nothing. We were flabbergasted. It certainly didn't seem like nothing had happened because Bobby was definitely shaken up by something. At first he was pale, visibly shaking, and he had this kind of vacant expression on his face. It's hard to explain. He seemed mostly just shocked by whatever it was he'd seen, but he was definitely disturbed too. We kept at it, begging him to tell us what he'd seen, but he just wouldn't say. All he'd give us was, "Nothing. Stop asking about it." We asked him if it was scary and he said yes, but he denied any kind of violence had occurred. The guy promised he wouldn't be touched, and he'd apparently been true to his word on that too. But that did mean they hadn't done something to Bobby, and despite all his denials, I know that was the case. The last thing he said about it, before he threatened to kick us out of his mom's house if we asked again, was a couple of hours later when Joey finally broke and asked him, "Dude, I'm begging you, at least give us a clue. What happened in there?" "Something that doesn't make sense," Bobby replied. He never talked about it ever again. I know that seems unbelievable, but time moves pretty fast at that age. We were due to start our junior year of high school. I started dating that first semester. Joey broke his arm on Bobby's skateboard that winter, and there was other stuff to think about. I'm not saying we just forgot about it and it came up in conversation once or twice in the months that followed, but every time we brought it up, Bobby would just give us this look. And the one time we persisted, he just walked back home without a word and didn't return our calls for a week. I'd like to say that dropping the subject for good repaired our friendship, but it didn't. Like I might have said earlier, what happened that night was the beginning of the end of our little friendship triangle, and we slowly began to drift apart. The end of the end, if that makes any sense, was when Bobby and his mom moved out to New Hampshire for her job. We all promised we'd keep in touch, but we never did, and I think me and Joey just bummed each other out after that, always wondering what happened to Bobby, always hoping he'd call someday, but he didn't call, and we didn't ever get the number for his new place. I still think about Bobby an awful lot, and I still think about him saying something that didn't make any sense. I've racked my dumb brain for literally decades, but I just can't work out what he meant by that. My wife thinks he was lying and that those carnival workers really did lay hands on him or something. Just because he didn't have any cuts or bruises doesn't mean they didn't slap him around or threaten him a little, and besides, you can do a lot worse things to someone without leaving a black eye or a bruised lip. I sometimes wonder if that really is true, that what happened to him was so traumatic that he just couldn't deal with it. But Bobby was brave, man. I think he was the bravest and most defiant person I've ever known. If the tough thing needed doing, Bobby did it. And I think that if that thing just so happened to be opening up about being hurt or something, Bobby would have done it. Maybe later rather than sooner, but he would have. And I think I'll just end this here. Whenever I talk about Bobby, every third word of my mouth is maybe, and I'm so sick of maybes that I can barely even describe it. I just hope his story isn't over yet, that he's out there, somewhere, living a happy, fruitful life. I try to look up him on Facebook every so often just to see if he made an account or something, but I've had no luck as of yet. But maybe next week, or maybe next year, I'll finally find out what happened to Bobby, and get to say hello to an old friend in the process. Maybe. Just maybe. Okay, so this isn't strictly my story, because the whole thing involves my grandpa and my great aunt, his sister. But since they're no longer with us anymore, it's one of the most horrifying true stories I've ever heard, and I figured I'm within my rights to tell it. My grandpa grew up during the Great Depression in a really poor town out in Oklahoma. I mean, the way my mom tells it, they really didn't have a pot to pee in. They used to eat stuff like dandelion salad, literally just eating boiled eggs with wild dandelions. They were that broke. Even worse for my grandpa and great aunt, who were like 12 and 8 years old respectively at this time, there's absolutely nothing to keep them entertained. They made a good go of it, turning pieces of junk into toys. Like, ever see that old-timey thing of a kid whipping a bike tire along with a stick? Yeah, that kind of thing. Their childhoods were just not like ours. They were accustomed to extreme boredom, grinding poverty, and backbreaking labor, so you can guess how excited they got when they heard the carnival was coming to town. There'd be games, rides, candy, sideshows, absolutely everything a kid that age could ever want. The only thing was, their family didn't have the money for them all to go, just enough for 2 entry tickets, with a little left over for cotton candy. So, being the good folks they were, my great-grandparents decided they'd give the kids the money while they stayed home. It must have been like all their Christmases had come at once. The only condition was that my 12-year-old grandpa was not to let my 8-year-old great-aunt out of his sight. Then, on the evening in question, Grandpa and great-aunt are given like 50 cents between them and told to be back by sundown. Then they run off down to the pasture where the carnival's been given permission to set up. The way my dad tells it, for the first hour or so, Grandpa and great-aunt had the time of their lives. I think tickets were like 5 cents or something, then cotton candy was 2 cents apiece. Basically, their parents had underestimated how expensive stuff would be, so they were able to partake in everything the carnival had to offer, twice. Maybe that's what lulled them into a false sense of security, because it certainly accounts for them staying long after the sun started to set. Only, when my grandpa realized how late it was and he started looking around for my great-aunt, she was nowhere to be seen. I once remember asking my dad why they just thought it was okay to let their kids go running around on their own like that, if it's just like an old-timey thing or because they were so poor. Dad said it was more like because all the people going to the carnival were their neighbors. They didn't figure there was any risk. But then there's my grandpa, totally unable to find his sister, and he's starting to get worried. He started asking all the people he recognized from our town if they'd seen his sister, but they all said no. Right up until one of our neighbors said they saw my great-aunt walking hand in hand with a grown-up. I think they figured it was my great-grandpa or something, but when my grandpa explains that his dad isn't even there, this guy launches into action to try and help find my great-aunt. So, Grandpa and this random neighbor guy apparently ran away from the actual carnival and towards where the workers had set up their trailers and whatnot. That's when they heard a girl crying from inside of them. The neighbor tries to open the door up, but it won't budge, so he starts banging on it. Some evil son of a gun opens the door and tries to explain it away by saying my great-aunt got lost or something, but she's just inconsolable, crying in a way that Grandpa had never seen before, scared but sad at the same time. This neighbor then rushes my grandpa and great-aunt home and tells their parents all about what had happened. My grandpa knows something bad happened to his sister, but he just doesn't know what because she sure won't talk about it. Obviously, my great-grandpa was absolutely furious, so he grabs a shotgun, rounds up a few buddies, and they went down to the carnival to basically do God knows what to this guy. Again, this is all from my dad, but according to him, this huge fight starts at the carnival. People on all sides almost get shot. Then they all freeze after the carnival chief fires a gun into the air. He then agrees to parlay with my great-grandpa. Then after talking for like 10 minutes in some weird-looking carny trailer, my great-grandpa walks away from the carnival empty-handed. Everyone thought he was crazy. Some monster had just put his hands on his only daughter, and after a short powwow with the man in charge, he was happy to just walk away. His buddies confront him on it, obviously wanting to know what the deal was, but my great-grandpa apparently tells them to put a sock in it, because it's all been ironed out. That night, my great-grandpa apparently puts on his boots and headed down to the carnival one more time before it left town. He meets up with the carny chief, who asks if my great-grandpa still wants satisfaction, which he obviously did. At that, the carny chief beckons to 2 workers who carry out like a basket or something before laying it in front of my great-grandpa. When they invited him to open the lid, he complied, and when the smell hit him, I doubt he had it in him not to puke. Because according to my dad, the carnies had stacked the offending worker's severed head on a pile of his own guts, and his own junk had been stuffed into his mouth. The carny chief then told him, while pointing at his junk, "First we cut off this, then we cut out those," then points to the guy's guts. "Only when he stopped moving did we cut off that," then points to his head. Apparently after that, the carny chief once again asked my great-grandpa, "Are you satisfied?" He just nodded, turned, and then walked away. the carnival was gone the next day. I think he told my great aunt what happened to that guy too, because she never seemed too torn up about it. I know something really bad must have happened if they killed the guy, but she actually went back to the carnival the next time it came around. And to borrow a phrase from my son, I guess they were built different back then and just dealt with trauma differently or whatever. Or maybe it's much easier to get over that sort of thing when you know the guy who did it suffered on Earth before he died. I suppose that's what freaks me out so much about my grandpa's story, that it almost sounds like it came from a different country or something. All that poverty and vigilante justice. I just don't recognize that same kind of thing in America today, not in such an extreme way anyways. And that sure has me counting my blessings, let me tell you. Organized crime is possibly the greatest plague that human society has ever faced. It's a phenomenon that's developed organically throughout almost every culture and nation that's ever existed, from the Thuggee cults of 13th century India to the Japanese Yakuza and the Russian Vors. It seems that certain sections of humanity are simply inclined towards criminality. And just like their law-abiding counterparts, they've found that coalition is often a superior choice to outright conflict. As we all know, the United States also has its fair share of organized crime, most often recognized in the forms of New York's Five Families, Murder, Inc., or perhaps the Crips and Bloods. But is it possible for smaller, less renowned, but more efficient forms of mafia to exist in 21st century America? And what if they took on some very unfamiliar, even comical new forms? Essentially what I'm asking is there any such thing as the Carnival Mafia? I can hear some of you laughing already, picturing guys in clown outfits doing the whole Joe Pesci bit of, funny how? How am I funny? Do I amuse you? But I'm serious, deadly serious. So without further ado, let me tell you the story of Alfred and Pauline Carpenter. Alfred and Pauline loved the carnival. Al, or Sonny as people sometimes called him, hailed from Oak Lawn in California, while Pauline was born in Walnut, Kansas. The couple were married on May 17th of 1986 in El Dorado, Kansas, and spent the next 32 years of their lives raising several loving children along the way. By all accounts, Pauline and Al were happiest when in each other's company, and many a photograph of the couple showed just how in love they really were. After retiring from aeronautical giant Boeing, where they both were employed, Al and Pauline made their living selling homemade jewelry at county fairs, and although it didn't exactly make them a mint, the nomadic lifestyle suited the septuagenarian couple immensely. They were able to meet interesting new people while traveling the country they loved, and best of all, they got to do it together. This is how they ended up in Great Bend, Kansas, on July 13th of 2018 during the Barton County Fair. It was a typically wholesome summer affair, featuring a tractor pull, Ferris wheel, a rabbit show, and a root beer float social. There were prizes for the best homegrown rhubarb stalks, green beans, and summer squash, along with a much-coveted trophy for the county's largest potato. Just like they'd done many times before, Al and Pauline Carpenter set up their stall, arranged their goods in charming displays, and began friendly bartering sessions with the local townsfolk. The vast majority of their interactions were positive, but it's believed that at some point during the day, some kind of confrontation occurred between the Carpenters and their fellow carnival workers. At first glance, the confrontation doesn't seem to be too significant, as Al and Pauline continue to operate their stall until the end of the working day, then simply retire to their RV for the evening. But as it turned out, the encounter would have deadly implications for them. 4 days later, on July 17th, the Van Buren Police Department received a rather distressing call from a woman who claimed her sister, Christine Tenney, was being held hostage. She went on to tell the dispatcher that 2 criminals had murdered a couple, stolen their RV, and were now holding her sister as a hostage at a residence known as the Vista Hill Apartments. Heavily armed police officers rushed to the apartment complex, and were greeted by the sights of a large camper van with bullet holes in it. So far, the information was good, but just as they were in the process of locking the apartment complex down, who should they find, alive and well, but Christine Tenney. Christine was baffled by the reports of her kidnapping, claiming she was in no danger whatsoever. But when the parked RV was searched, police found trash bags full of bloody paper towels, blood-soaked clothing, and 2 spent 9mm bullet casings. It was quite obvious that some kind of violent struggle, perhaps even a murder, had taken place in the RV, and when the cops ran the vehicle's plates to discover who the owner was, Al Carpenter's name came back. Naturally, the police were very interested in talking to the person that had made the report in the first place. Given they had the caller's sister, it was quite easy to track them down, and the person in question turned out to be a 52-year-old Florida woman named Kimberly Younger. Not only did Kimberly have a weak explanation as to why she thought her sister was in danger, chalking it up to a simple miscommunication, but she claimed that Al and Pauline Carpenter were just fine, and that she'd given them a ride to a casino in the hours before their RV was stolen. It's then the cops noticed that Kimberly didn't seem to own a car, and when pressed as to what vehicle she'd used to give the Carpenters a ride, she claimed to have hired a car from a rental place that she couldn't remember the name of. Obviously, investigating officers found this to be highly suspicious, and they ordered the arrest of several carnival workers. When 2 of these carnival workers turned out to be none other than Christine Tenney and an ex-boyfriend of Kimberly Younger's named Michael Fowler, police began to realize they were onto something. Then, when Michael Fowler seemed to display an alarming amount of guilt during an interview, police applied the right amount of pressure, and he broke. Through tears of anguish and remorse, Fowler admitted to murdering the Carpenters, and is reported to have said, "She had me suckered the whole time. I just threw my whole life away. It was supposed to be my blood in." When police asked what he meant by blood in, they were well aware of the gangland connotations, but what kind of organization could this lowly carnival worker have been trying to enter? After agreeing to cooperate with the authorities to avoid the death penalty, Fowler showed them the shallow graves in Arkansas where the Carpenters were buried, then went about telling them everything he knew. He claimed to have been in communication with a man named Frank Zaitchik, owner and operator of a Michigan-based traveling carnival company called Wade Shows, Inc. But according to Michael Fowler, Frank had another, considerably more sinister occupation: leader of the Carnival Mafia. At some point during questioning, Fowler got out his phone and showed police a series of Facebook messages purported to be between him and Frank Zaitchik. In one message at around 2:30 a.m. on July 14th, Fowler had written, "It's done. They're dead." "Good job, now get out," Frank Zaitchik replied. "I'm trying to calm down right now," Fowler wrote back. "Deep breaths," read Zaitchik's response. "The first is always the hardest. Jen sent me pictures of the man. I sent on to the heads of council. War is over." Police tried tracking Zaitchik down and were successful in finding a Michigan carnival operator by the same name, but Zaitchik denied having any knowledge of the killings and categorically denied that there was any such thing as the Carnival Mafia. Zaitchik went on to say that he didn't know the alleged suspects or the victims. As far as he could recall, they had never been employed by Wade Shows, Inc. He was quick to add that he had no idea why they would use his name. "It's kind of bone-chilling," he said. "I'd like to talk to the cops about it, but no one's reached out. I'm a solid citizen. I have nothing to hide, and Wade Shows has a wonderful reputation." Zaitchik went on to deny ownership of the Facebook account that was in communication with the murderer, despite the fact that it included several seemingly intimate photographs of him. All the cops had to do was establish a concrete link between Zaitchik and the killer, and they had a solid murder case. But then, just a few days later, Kimberly Younger contacted police with a jaw-dropping confession. She claimed to have set up a false Facebook account and had been posing as Frank Zaitchik in order to trick her ex-boyfriend into murdering the Carpenters. She seemed desperate to absolve Zaitchik of all culpability and assured police that she and she alone was responsible for ordering the Carpenters' death. It's also possible that it was she who revealed the involvement of 37-year-old Texas man named Rusty Frazier. Frazier is said to have facilitated the murders in some manner, possibly by either supplying the weapon or aiding in the disposal of the bodies. It's not clear if Rusty Frazier was working the Barton County Fair around the time that the Carpenters were killed, but his ability to quickly transport the remains out of the state suggests that there may be an even wider network of people who had a hand in the murders. Most of those arrested vehemently denied the existence of any kind of carnival mafia and insisted they acted alone. Michael Fowler later retracted his statements about it being a blood-in style initiation and insisted he simply had been tricked as part of a petty personal rivalry. Kimberly Younger had also spoken of a kind of carny mafia and gave the police some rather detailed stories of how they laundered money, collected protection money, and murdered anyone who refused to cooperate. Yet she too retracted her statements after the police investigated Frank Zaitchik's role in the murders, almost as if though they'd been warned to shut their mouths or face the consequences. Officially, law enforcement in both Kansas and Arkansas have stated that there is no carnival mafia, maintaining the concept as nothing more than the frantic fabrication of two murder suspects. But at the same time, there has never been any conclusive explanation as to why exactly the Carpenters were murdered. It's often explained away as a disagreement or confrontation that suddenly turned violent, but even so, the root cause of the conflict had never been accounted for. Could it be that the argument arose over the Carpenters' refusal to pay protection money, and were the Carpenters killed so that the carnival mafia could make an example out of them? If the official statement of the police is to be believed, then no, it's all just a crazy coincidence. Frank Zaitchik's name was picked because he's the wealthy owner of several successful fairgrounds. But until the root cause of the confrontation is confirmed, until we have an actual concrete motive for the Carpenters' murders, there's still room to wonder. Is there really such a thing as the carnival mafia? Mark Anthony Tildesley was born on August 31st of 1976 to John and Lavinia Tildesley. The Tildesleys lived in the small English town of Wokingham in Berkshire, and in 1984, 7-year-old Mark was a Year 3 pupil at the nearby Palmer Church of England Junior School. On May 25th, Mark's school was on break for its summer half-term holiday, and given as a lot of young children had nothing to occupy themselves with, the Frank Ayers Fun Fair had come to town during that holiday week. To say Mark was eager to visit the fun fair would be an understatement of the century. He saved up his 30-pence weekly pocket money for an entire month, and added to his savings by doing odd jobs under the supervision of his parents. Mark became somewhat famous around the town for being the industrious little redhead with a rather sizable collection of 10-pence pieces. A local shopkeeper, Margaret Hickman, was fond of little Mark and has many happy memories of him counting out the right number of coins to pay for his candy. So on the afternoon of June 1st, 1984, when Mark handed over a 50-pence piece to pay for his candies, Margaret found it very odd indeed. She watched Mark collect up his goods before returning to an adult outside, but it wasn't Mark's father or mother. In fact, Margaret didn't recognize the man at all. This was also odd because pretty much everyone in town knew each other and could instantly recognize an outsider. But since she also overheard the man tell Mark that he was going to the fair later that day and that he would pay for him to go on the dodgems that evening, she figured he was simply an older relative. Later that day, just after 5:30, Mark rode his gold Raleigh Tomahawk bicycle the half-mile to the carnival ground. He promised his parents that he'd be back home no later than 7:30 p.m., with his mother recalling him saying, "Don't worry, Mom, I won't be late." While en route to the carnival, he apparently met up with two school friends, but they wanted to go back home to change before heading down to the fairgrounds. So Mark made the decision to ride down alone, hoping to scout out the best rides before friends showed up. A few hours later, back at the Tildesleys' house, it was fast approaching 7:30 and there was no sign of young Mark. 7:30 came and went, but by the time 7:45 rolled around, Mark's parents were beginning to get worried, and by 8 p.m. sharp, they left their home to look for him down at the fairgrounds. On their arrival, the first thing they noticed was his gold Raleigh tomahawk chained up to a metal fence near the fair's entrance. This seemed to confirm that Mark was still present, but after searching all over the carnival, John and Lavinia couldn't find hide nor hair of their son. At around 10 p.m., a terrified Lavinia contacted the Wokingham Constabulary to report Mark missing, and subsequently enlisted the help of some relatives in continuing the search, but again, not a single trace of little Mark was to be found. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in British history. A ragtag team of police officers, civilian volunteers, and soldiers, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, made up a force that numbered in the hundreds. Then, along with canine and helicopter support, the team scoured every inch of Wokingham town center, as well as the surrounding farmland. Several horrifying false alarms were recorded, the first coming when a train driver claimed to have seen a fox carrying a child's arm in its mouth. Incredibly, this fox was tracked down, but the severed limb turned out to be that of a fowl's, much to the relief of all involved. Then came the call from the nearby village of Crawthorne, where a resident reported a distinct odor of rotting flesh coming from a wooded area behind his backyard. But thankfully, the smell was actually caused by a dead sheep, and the hope for Mark's safe return was kept alight. A national appeal for information yielded hundreds of tips from members of the public, and although several reports starkly contradicted one another, one particular report was chillingly possible. A man contacted police to say he caught a glimpse of a boy fitting Mark's description being dragged against his will away from the fairground site between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. that evening. The man added that he assumed the person was a relative, and only realized that might not have been the case when he heard the news of Mark's disappearance. When asked what this man looked like, the caller didn't know, and could only add that the man had terrible posture and appeared to be ever so slightly hunchbacked. In the course of their investigation, local police went about collecting the names of all carnival workers present that evening. After working their way down the list, interviewing and eliminating several of the workers, police reached the name Sidney Cook. They discovered he was a 57-year-old Londoner, and once they learned of his address via the electrical roll, police officers visited Cook at his home, only to discover that Sidney was ever so slightly hunchbacked. When the police asked Cook whether he was in Wokingham on the night Mark disappeared, he not only said no, but he insisted he had an alibi too. He claimed there were people who could vouch that he was working at a fair opposite West Hendon police station in London, and the fair's manager confirmed that Cook was indeed their employee. This forced the police to officially eliminate Cook from their investigation, but he was always viewed with deep suspicion by the investigating detectives, which is why it was shocking but not surprising when Cook's name reappeared in the course of a child murder investigation a few years later. But when it did reappear, it would be in one of the most disturbing ways imaginable. After the arrest of a man named Leslie Catweasel Bailey in 1999, police obtained a letter that chilled the blood of all those who read it. The letter consisted of directions to a shallow grave, one dug into some woodland out in Berkshire. The letter referenced being the final resting place of a boy that had been found at a fair, and it was addressed to none other than Sidney Cook. When confronted with the letter, Sidney confessed to abducting Mark Tildesley, but what he and a select group of friends did next is frankly too terrible to talk about in detail. Let's just say Mark's final moments involved forced ingestion of narcotics, then terrifying levels of mental and physical abuse, and the men who committed these crimes called themselves the Dirty Dozen. This cabal of disgusting sadistic abusers consisted of Sidney Cook, his arrested associate Leslie Bailey, a man named Lenny Smith, and an individual known only as Oddbod. Leslie Bailey was the only member of the gang who was honest enough to admit what they'd done, and his testimony secured the convictions of Sidney Cook. But that didn't mean he was shown any mercy when he was strangled by another inmate after his conviction and imprisonment. When news of his murder reached John and Lavinia Tildesley, John said he would like to shake the murderer's hand, whilst Lavinia is said to have opened a bottle of wine to celebrate the occasion. Lenny Smith managed to escape all charges by casting as much doubt on Bailey's story as possible, but he didn't escape justice entirely. In 2006, Lenny would die of acquired immune deficiency syndrome in Nottingham prison. Again, the Tildsleys celebrated the news of his long drawn-out and painful death. The fourth man, known only as Odd Bod, was confirmed to be a blood relative of Leslie Bailey. The reason he's only referred to as this bizarre nickname, and in official court documentation at that, is because Odd Bod is so heavily mentally disabled that he's said to have the mind of an 8-year-old. As a result, Odd Bod could not be named, charged, or put on trial or sentenced in connection with Mark's murder. As of 2021, 94-year-old Sidney Cook is the only surviving member of the so-called Dirty Dozen. It's believed that although someone else disposed of Mark's body, Sidney knows where the boy is buried but refuses to tell the police or the boy's family the exact location of their son's final resting place. This is thought to be a depraved method of control, his final method of taking Mark away from his grieving parents. Because, if only Sidney knows where their son is buried, then via the sick lens through which he views the world, he still owns him. He took a piece of their boy, and they can never get it back. I think we can all agree that men like Sidney Cook are proof that monsters really do exist. On September 17th of 1992, 14-year-old Misty Donna Copsey accompanied her friend Trina to the Rural State Fair in Puyallup, Washington. Misty was due to return home to Spanaway on the 8:40 p.m. bus, but shortly after, called her mother to inform her that she'd missed its departure, but would be getting a ride back with a friend of hers named Reuben Schmidt. Yet despite being longtime friends, Misty's mother had taken an inexplicable dislike to the young man and forbid her daughter from getting a ride home with him, even if it meant she had to walk the full 8 miles between Puyallup and her neighborhood. A witness is said to have spotted her in downtown Puyallup, walking along in the direction of the Highway 512 on-ramp. This is the last time anyone would see Misty alive. It took a week before a missing persons report was filed, and investigating officers found that Misty's home life was far from pleasant. Her mother struggled with chronic alcoholism. She had a criminal record for welfare fraud, and she often left her daughter unsupervised for extended periods of time. It took her a full 7 days to even notice her daughter was gone, and it goes without saying that Misty's case was just as likely to one of a runaway child than any kind of abduction. That being said, the case was thrown into doubt almost as quickly as it opened, as 2 of Misty's classmates claimed to have seen and spoken to her in the week prior. The case wasn't entirely closed, but it gave the police the impression that the missing persons report was nothing more than a tragic mistake. It took weeks before the investigation was taken seriously, and it took a whopping 5 months for law enforcement to interview the 2 people that had last seen her. One of these people was a friend of Misty's named Trina Brevard, who had accompanied Misty to the Puyallup Fair. Trina said that on the night in question, Misty had gotten the bus, while it was her that was forced to walk home. This confused the investigating officers somewhat, and it was only when they continued to poke and prod at Trina's story that they realized she might be lying. Their suspicion was vindicated when they discovered that Trina hadn't walked home at all, and that she'd gotten a ride from her 23-year-old boyfriend, Michael J. Reiner. Due to the disgustingly illegal nature of their relationship, 14-year-old Trina had kept her much older boyfriend a secret from her friends and family. But that's not the only thing the investigation uncovered. Despite having no adult criminal history, Michael had been arrested as a juvenile on charges of abduction and assault, and given the nature of Misty's disappearance, his past made him a prime suspect. When the truth came out, Trina stated that Michael had initially offered Misty a ride, but she'd refused on account of an intense dislike for him and opted to walk home instead. This led police to theorize that after dropping Trina off back home, Michael had driven back towards the state fair, knowing Misty would be alone and vulnerable. But after he was brought in for questioning, Michael not only passed a polygraph test, but seemed genuinely horrified about her disappearance, offering his full cooperation in any future investigations. Although he was a very suspicious character, the police eventually eliminated Michael as a suspect and turned to other theories to explain Misty's disappearance. Then came the interviews with Misty's forbidden friend, Reuben Schmidt, which were suspicious to say the least. Reuben corroborated everything Trina had said, but for some reason added that he was suffering from chronic blackouts and couldn't remember anything from the night of Misty's disappearance. He claimed that after blacking out during the evening, he had woken up back at his grandma's place in the foothills of Mount Rainier. When asked by police if it was possible that he could have hurt Misty during one of his blackouts, Reuben told them, "I don't know." Police then tried to gain a little background knowledge on Reuben, and they turned to Misty's mother, who may well have had a good reason to dislike the boy. She claimed Reuben was obsessed with Misty, that his infatuation had grown over the years to the point of being unhealthy, and as of late, Reuben had been increasingly aggressive with her, calling her at all hours of the day with pleas to join him on dates. When subject to a polygraph, Reuben's results came out inconclusive, and investigators strongly suspected that he was trying to deceive them in some way. It is understood that Reuben was the case's #1 suspect for a while, right up until late 1992 when suspicion was cast on a third suspect. A local misfit by the name of Corey Bober was said to have become obsessed with Gary Ridgway, better known as Washington's own Green River Killer. There were also 2 unsolved murders of teen girls from the local area, and Bober was said to be obsessed with linking them to Ridgway and the wider Green River killings. Local law enforcement already had an intense dislike of Bober, who had a reputation as being paranoid, unstable, and obnoxious, and he came to their attention in Misty's case because he had reached out to her mother on multiple occasions, urging her to pressure the local police into linking her daughter's disappearance to the murders of the 2 local girls, Kimberly DeLonge and Anna Chebanoy. Both DeLonge and Chebanoy had vanished from the same Puyallup shopping center in 1988 and 1990, respectively, with their bodies found hidden in dense brush off Highway 410 in 1991, less than 100 feet from one another. Bober was also intimately involved in the search for Misty and helped her mother search the same area where DeLonge and Chebanoy's bodies were found. It's believed that he was present the day that Misty's jeans, underwear, and one of her socks were discovered near Highway 410 and Waco Road near Mud Mountain Dam. The items had been rolled neatly and placed in a muddy ditch. Yet despite such a significant discovery, the investigation continued to flounder. The following year, Reuben Schmidt once again seemed to implicate himself when he seemed to hint that he knew where Misty's body was. He apparently told a fellow restaurant employee that investigators were off and that she was buried 6 miles from where her clothing had been found earlier that year. On top of that, Schmidt's grandmother's farm was located around 6 miles from the burial site on Highway 410. Yet for some reason, police simply couldn't collate enough evidence to charge him, and by the end of 1993, the case had essentially gone cold. But when we consider some of the other facts at hand, it seems only a gross mishandling of the investigation can explain why he wasn't arrested. When confronted about making comments suggesting he knew where Misty was buried, Schmidt made the bizarre claim that he'd only made them to get people off his back, since he had regularly been accused both playfully and seriously of being Misty's murderer. Reuben went on to show other violent tendencies, being accused of assault in 1996 and having his wife file a restraining order against him in 2006 after he threatened to burn her house down. It was also later discovered that, for some reason, Reuben had sold his car in the aftermath of Misty's disappearance. When confronted about this by police, he had no legitimate reason for doing so, but again, this highly suspicious little factoid seems to have been completely glossed over. And once again, the most obvious suspects seem to have escaped any concrete charges. But then again, maybe that's because there are just so many other plausible suspects. For example, for anyone investigating missing girls in 90s-era Pacific Northwest, to not include Gary Ridgway as a suspect would verge on grossly incompetent. The Green River Killer confessed to no less than 71 different murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Yet for a man who was apparently so open and honest about his depravity, Ridgway flatly denied having anything to do with Misty's murder, and the area she vanished from was well out of Ridgway's regular stalking ground. Then there's convicted kidnapper Robert Hickey, who was sentenced for a separate crime shortly after Misty vanished. He served several years in prison only to commit a crime of similar depravity once he was released from prison. Seeing him as an irredeemable threat to society, a judge then sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Hickey was apparently driving a red Camaro at the time of Misty's disappearance, which may well account for a series of red paint chips found on her body. Yet when confronted by police, he denied having killed or abducted her, and officers must have been satisfied with whatever alibi he had to offer because he was soon dropped as a suspect. It seems that a tragic combination of minimal information, unreliable witnesses, and a weak investigation meant Misty Copsey's killer might never be brought to justice. Misty's mother had a few choice words for the Puyallup PD, saying their failure to arrest and convict Reuben Schmidt was a catastrophic blunder, and that they should have gotten to work finding her much sooner instead of waiting months to interview key witnesses. In recent years, the Puyallup Police Department, as well as the local sheriff's office, have revitalized public information campaigns in hopes that renewed interest in the case may bring forth new and pertinent information. The use of DNA analysis may be able to reveal new information regarding Misty's disappearance. Although it's been over 20 years since she vanished, Misty's mother is still desperate for answers. Someone, somewhere, must know something, she was quoted as saying. So please, I'm begging you, if you know what happened to my daughter, please call the Puyallup PD. But it seems the only person who really knows the truth of Misty's fate is the one who buried her. And if the past 30 years are anything to go by, her killer certainly won't be revealing himself anytime soon. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.